The kitchen smelled of freshly brewed coffee, the scent of warm steam rising in the early morning light. Samantha stood by the counter, the hum of the coffee machine filling the silence. Her eyes flickered toward the clock on the wall, noting the time, 7:15 a.m. Another morning. Another day spent in the same routine. She stirred the coffee absent-mindedly, watching the cream swirl into the dark liquid. Her mind wandered back to the night before, to the quiet dinner with Mark, the usual questions about work and the kids. There was nothing remarkable about it, just another evening in a marriage that felt more like an obligation than a connection. She had been so distracted, lost in thought, that she hadn't even noticed when Mark stopped talking, his voice fading into the background as her mind focused on the unfamiliar pull she felt towards something else, someone else. She hadn't meant for it to happen. It was never part of the plan. But life had a way of pushing you into corners, leaving you with choices that didn't seem like choices at all. Ethan had come into her life like a breath of fresh air, his presence an escape from the dull ache of the years she had spent beside Mark. He was everything Mark wasn't: attentive, affectionate, spontaneous. They'd met through a mutual friend at a volunteer event, and their conversations had been effortless. But it wasn't just the easy flow of conversation that had drawn her in. It was the way he noticed the little things about her, things Mark had stopped seeing years ago. Ethan had made her feel alive again. The first kiss had come when she was at her most vulnerable. After a particularly long day of feeling invisible at home, she had sought refuge at the local park. She hadn't expected Ethan to show up, but he had, leaning against the old oak tree with that smirk of his, as if he knew exactly what she needed. They talked for hours about everything and nothing. And then, as if the world had faded away and there was only the two of them, Ethan had kissed her. At first, she'd pulled away, guilt twisting in her stomach. She was married, for God's sake. But his hand on her face, the warmth of his breath, the way his lips lingered against hers, it felt like a spark in a dark room. It was brief, but it ignited something in her that she had forgotten existed. From that moment on, the affair began slowly. Just texts at first, innocuous, flirty, harmless. But each message pulled her further away from the woman she once was. She found herself looking forward to the late-night phone calls, the stolen moments in his car after work, the shared secrets and laughter that felt like something real. Something she didn't have with Mark anymore. But with each passing day, the guilt weighed heavier on her shoulders. She couldn't seem to balance the life she was leading with Mark and the world she was beginning to build with Ethan. Every touch, every kiss felt like a betrayal. Yet when she was with Ethan, she couldn't remember why she had ever stopped living for herself. It was early one morning as she made breakfast for the kids that the reality hit her. She hadn't meant for things to go this far, but now, the affair was more than just a secret, it was a part of her. She wasn't sure when it stopped being about passion and began to feel like a need, like an addiction. The knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Samantha blinked, startled, and turned toward the door. Mark was standing in the doorway, his briefcase in hand, his tired eyes already scanning the room. The weight of the moment settled over her like a cloud. He didn't know. He couldn't possibly know. "Morning," Mark said, his voice rough from sleep. "Kids are ready for school?" "Yeah," Samantha replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "They're almost out the door." Mark glanced at her as he set his briefcase down on the table. "You okay?" His voice was filled with concern, but there was something behind his question that she couldn't quite place. Something more than the casual tone of someone who had just woken up and wasn't fully awake yet. Samantha nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just tired." He didn't push, but the question hung in the air between them, unanswered. Mark kissed her cheek, a fleeting gesture, before he disappeared into the next room. She stood there, frozen for a moment, her heart pounding. That was when she realized how far gone they were, how distant they had become. She could feel herself drifting, emotionally tethered to Ethan, yet physically bound to Mark. She wasn't sure if she could fix this. Part of her didn't even know where to begin. The days passed in a blur of guilt and longing. Ethan became more than just a distraction. He became a lifeline. Each secret meeting, each quiet kiss, each whispered promise made her feel alive again. But the pull of her family, the life she had built with Mark, kept her from fully surrendering to the affair. Then came the moment that changed everything. It had been a month since she had last seen Ethan. They had met for a quick drink at a local bar, but it hadn't been enough. She needed more. She needed him. That was when she found out she was pregnant. Her heart stopped at the realization. It was too much. Too soon. She had no idea what to do. Mark would never forgive her. The thought of telling him made her stomach churn with fear and dread. The thought of losing everything she had built with him, the family, the house, the life they had, it seemed unbearable. But the thought of losing Ethan, of giving up the one part of her life that made her feel anything, was just as terrifying. Samantha spent days in a fog, trying to decide what to do. She couldn't keep the pregnancy a secret forever. Eventually, she would have to tell Mark. But what would she say? How would she even begin to explain everything? When the day finally came, when she sat Mark down and told him everything, she could feel the shift in the room. The silence was deafening. Mark's eyes went cold, the hurt and betrayal written across his face as he tried to process what she had just told him. "You've been seeing him," he said, his voice tight with disbelief. Samantha nodded, tears streaming down her face. "It wasn't supposed to happen this way, Mark. I never wanted to hurt you." Mark's expression was a mixture of anger and hurt. "How long? How long has this been going on?" "I didn't plan it," Samantha whispered, the words tasting like poison in her mouth. "It just happened." The confrontation left both of them raw and broken. Mark couldn't look at her the same way anymore. Every conversation they had after that was filled with silence, awkwardness, and tension. She could feel the distance growing between them, the space between them growing wider and wider. Ethan was there for her, offering comfort and understanding, but even he couldn't fix what she had broken. He wasn't Mark. He wasn't her family. In the weeks that followed, the emotional turmoil only deepened. Mark tried to forgive her, tried to move forward, but the betrayal lingered like an unhealed wound. He kept his distance emotionally, but he stayed physically, because of the pregnancy, because of the kids. Samantha knew she had hurt him deeply, and nothing she could say would ever make it right. But even as they tried to rebuild, Samantha knew deep down that their relationship would never be the same. The love they had once shared, the connection they once felt, had been broken, shattered beyond repair. The affair, the pregnancy, it had changed everything. It was a slow and painful process of healing, but it wasn't enough to fix what was lost. She spent months trying to reconcile the woman she had been, the woman she was now, and the woman she wanted to become. Eventually, she realized that some things couldn't be fixed. Some things couldn't be mended. And in the end, she had to learn to forgive herself before she could move on. And so, the story ended not with a neatly tied conclusion, but with a haunting sense of what was left behind, the shattered pieces of a life that had once been whole, the echo of love that had been lost, and the quiet resolve to begin again, one day at a time. The house felt quieter now, the once bustling halls echoing with the sounds of a family that no longer seemed to fit together. Samantha stood by the window, staring out at the rain that had begun to fall, blurring the world outside. It was a familiar sight, but today it seemed different, like the rain had come to wash away everything that had happened, to cleanse the air of the weight that had settled between her and Mark. She couldn't escape the feeling of being trapped in a life that wasn't hers anymore. Everything she had once known, everything that had once been comfortable and secure, felt foreign now. She couldn't remember the last time she'd truly felt connected to Mark, when their love had been more than just routine, when their touches had meant something beyond duty. Her hand rested on the cool glass of the window, the rain streaking down in long lines as if mirroring the tears she couldn't bring herself to shed. The pregnancy, the affair, it had all been too much. Mark's presence in the house, the emptiness between them, only amplified the fact that they were no longer the same people who had once vowed to spend their lives together. Yet, in the silence, there was still love tinged with regret, but love nonetheless. Samantha wasn't sure how to navigate it anymore. She wasn't sure if they could ever fix what had been broken, or if they even wanted to. The door opened behind her, and she didn't have to turn around to know it was Mark. He had that way of entering a room without making a sound, his presence a quiet reminder of everything that had gone wrong. He stood there for a moment, silent. She could feel his eyes on her, but she couldn't bring herself to meet his gaze. There were too many unsaid things between them, too many wounds that hadn't healed. Finally he spoke, his voice low and strained. "You know, when I married you, I thought we'd be able to weather anything. I never imagined this." Samantha's heart twisted. "Neither did I," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I never wanted this. I never wanted to hurt you, Mark." He didn't respond immediately, the silence stretching out between them like a chasm. When he did speak again, his words were laced with pain. "Do you even love me anymore?" The question hit her like a cold wind, leaving her breathless. She didn't have an answer. How could she? The love they had once shared felt so distant now, like a faded photograph, the edges curling and the colors bleeding out. She still cared for him, she did, but love, real love, had been lost somewhere along the way. And she wasn't sure if it could ever be found again. I don't know, she admitted, her voice breaking. Mark's sigh was heavy, filled with the weight of disappointment and sorrow. He stepped closer to her, his presence still familiar despite the distance between them. I don't know if I can do this anymore, Sam, he said softly. I don't know if I can keep living in this limbo. Samantha turned to face him, her heart aching with the truth of his words. Mark, please, I never wanted to hurt you. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. His gaze softened, but there was something in his eyes, a resignation that she hadn't seen before. I know you didn't mean it, he said quietly. But it doesn't change the fact that it did happen. And now, I don't know who we are anymore. We've changed, Sam. And I don't know if I can find my way back to you. The tears that had been threatening to spill finally broke free. She wiped at her eyes, not wanting him to see her weakness, but it was too late. The walls she had built around her emotions had crumbled, and there was no stopping the flood. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry. Mark didn't move closer, but he didn't leave either. The distance between them was palpable, yet his presence was still a comfort, even in the pain. For a moment they stood there, both lost in the weight of what had happened. Neither of them knew what the future held, but one thing was certain: they were at a crossroads and they couldn't go back. After a long silence, Mark finally spoke again, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know if we can fix this, Sam. But maybe we don't need to fix it. Maybe we just need to let go. Her heart sank at his words. Letting go. Could they really do that? Could they really walk away from everything they had built, from the years spent together, from the love that had once been so strong? I don't want to let go, she whispered, her voice breaking. I don't want to lose you. Mark's expression softened, and for a moment, it was as if they were back in the early days of their relationship, when everything had been so easy, so full of hope. But that was gone now, and there was no pretending that it could be found again. I don't want to lose you either, he said quietly. But sometimes holding on too tight just hurts more. Samantha looked at him, tears blurring her vision. So what now? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mark shook his head, his eyes filled with sadness and uncertainty. I don't know, Sam. I really don't know. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken words, with all the things they couldn't say to each other. And in that moment, Samantha realized something. She had spent so long trying to fix the pieces of her broken life, trying to hold on to something that was slipping away. But maybe it was time to let go. Maybe, just maybe, they both needed to let go. Weeks passed, and the days blurred together. The affair had ended, the guilt still lingering in the air like a shadow. Mark had moved out of the bedroom, and the space between them had only grown. But it was a quiet sort of distance, one they had both come to accept. Samantha spent her days trying to figure out what came next. The pregnancy was still a secret, one she didn't know how to face, but each day she grew closer to the inevitable decision that needed to be made. Mark's absence weighed on her. She missed his presence in the house, the quiet comfort of his routine, even if the love had faded. It was an ache she couldn't ignore. But Ethan's presence, though a balm for her loneliness, wasn't the answer either. The affair had caused enough damage, and the last thing she needed was another complication. One afternoon, as the light began to shift in the late afternoon, Samantha found herself standing at the edge of the garden, the wind brushing through her hair. The rain had stopped, leaving the earth rich and damp, the smell of wet soil filling her senses. She closed her eyes, taking in the moment. She wasn't sure where she was going or what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was finally ready to face it. She didn't need to fix everything. Maybe it wasn't about fixing at all. Maybe it was about letting go, about finding peace with the brokenness, and allowing herself to start over. When she turned back toward the house, she didn't know what the future would bring. But she knew one thing for sure: she was ready to face it, whatever it was. The final confrontation, the lingering questions about her future, the child she was carrying, all of it would come to a head. But in that moment, with the rain still fresh in the air and the world beginning to heal, Samantha knew she had to make her own decisions. No one else could do it for her. And perhaps in letting go, she would find the freedom to rebuild her life, her family, and maybe even her own heart. As the days turned into weeks, Samantha's life continued on in its quiet upheaval. The house, though still a place she had once called home, now felt more like a collection of rooms that held memories she wasn't sure she wanted to keep. Each step she took seemed weighted with the realization that things would never go back to the way they were. She couldn't go back, and neither could Mark. The pregnancy had become something she couldn't ignore, even as much as she tried to bury it. Each morning brought a new round of nausea, a reminder of the mistake she had made, and every evening, when the world outside grew quiet and the house settled into its nighttime rhythm, the weight of the decision she was facing grew heavier. She had no answers. Not yet. Mark's absence in the house, though palpable, was a strange kind of relief. Their time apart had given her room to think, to breathe. But even that space, once a sanctuary, had its limits. She missed the simplicity of their life before things had become complicated. But she also knew she couldn't live in that past any longer. The past didn't exist for her anymore. Her thoughts often drifted to Ethan. She had seen him in passing a few times, their eyes meeting awkwardly, filled with guilt and uncertainty. But she couldn't deny the attraction that had sparked between them, the way his presence seemed to calm her in ways Mark no longer did. It was a fleeting moment of connection in an otherwise fractured world, but it was a moment that left her wondering if there was something more. The idea of starting over, of leaving this house and everything tied to the old life, began to settle in her mind like a quiet whisper. But there was so much at stake: her relationship with Mark, the future of her unborn child, and the tangled web of emotions that still tied her to both men. The complexity of it all felt suffocating, but it was her reality. One evening, after a long day of sorting through paperwork and trying to organize her thoughts, Samantha decided to take a walk. The house felt stifling, and she needed to get outside, away from the confusion and the quiet tension that seemed to follow her wherever she went. She found herself standing at the edge of the garden once again, the grass cool beneath her bare feet. The sky was overcast, and the faint hum of distant traffic mixed with the sound of rustling leaves. It was peaceful here, but there was something else in the air, something that felt like a turning point. A shift. Samantha closed her eyes for a moment, letting the wind wash over her. She thought about the future, about the choices she had to make, about whether or not she could ever truly forgive herself for the affair, for the lies, and for the person she had become. But maybe, just maybe, forgiveness wasn't something she needed to seek from others. Maybe it was something she needed to give herself. As she opened her eyes, her gaze shifted toward the house. In that moment, she realized something. She wasn't ready to face everything just yet. She wasn't ready to make all the decisions, figure out where her life was heading, and who would be in it. But she knew she couldn't stay stuck. She had to move forward. Later that night, when Mark came home, the air between them felt different. There was no confrontation, no shouting, no accusations. Just a quiet understanding that the distance between them had grown so much that words didn't seem to matter anymore. They moved through the evening in silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. But even in that silence, Samantha couldn't help but feel that something was breaking. The walls they had built around themselves had started to crumble, bit by bit. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic scene. It was just a quiet acknowledgement that they were no longer the people they had been when they first got married. The next few days passed in much the same way, with Samantha continuing to wrestle with her thoughts and emotions. There were no easy answers, no simple way forward, but there was something in her that had shifted. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach. The weight she had been carrying, the uncertainty about everything, was starting to ease. And then, one afternoon, as she sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea in her hands, the doorbell rang. It was unexpected, a sudden interruption to the quiet rhythm of her day. She opened the door to find Ethan standing there, his expression a mix of concern and something else, something that made her heart skip a beat. "Hey," he said softly. "Can we talk?" Samantha hesitated for a moment, her hand still resting on the doorknob. She wasn't sure if she was ready for this conversation, or what it would even mean. But she stepped aside, allowing him to enter. The tension between them was palpable as they sat across from each other at the kitchen table. Neither of them spoke at first, the weight of the situation hanging in the air like a thick fog. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "I don't know where we go from here, Sam. I don't even know if there's a place for us anymore." Samantha looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. She had so many questions, so many thoughts racing through her mind. But for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel the need to have all the answers. She just needed to listen. "I don't know either," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I know I need to figure this out. All of it. The affair, the pregnancy. Mark, I don't know where I'm going, but I know I can't stay here and pretend like everything's fine anymore." Ethan nodded, his gaze softening. "I just want you to know that I'm here. I'm not going anywhere, Sam. Whatever happens, I'm here for you." The sincerity in his words hit her like a wave. She didn't know what the future held for them, or if there even was a future for them. But in that moment, with everything so uncertain, Samantha felt something she hadn't in a long time. Hope. And as the evening drew to a close, she found herself finally ready to face the future, whatever it looked like. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be perfect. But she was ready to try. The next morning, as the sun peeked through the clouds, Samantha felt a small but significant shift within herself. The journey ahead would be long, filled with challenges and difficult decisions. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was taking control of her own life. She didn't have all the answers, but she was ready to start finding them. And maybe, just maybe, she could find her way back to herself. It wasn't the end, but it was a beginning. The days that followed felt different. The heaviness that had settled over her heart in the weeks prior seemed to lift just slightly, like the first faint rays of light peeking through a long, dark night. Samantha's life was still in pieces, but the fragments didn't seem quite as scattered, not anymore. She was no longer trapped in the limbo of indecision and guilt. There was a quiet resolve in her now, a faint ember of strength that she hadn't known she possessed. She continued with her routine, though everything felt filtered through a new lens. The walk down the street in the mornings felt different, her eyes catching the details she had once ignored. The sunlight through the trees, the way the air smelled fresh after the rain. These things didn't seem trivial anymore. They were reminders of life moving on, even in the midst of everything else. She still hadn't made up her mind about everything, about the baby, about Mark, about what role Ethan would play in her life going forward. But the weight of her decisions no longer paralyzed her. She realized that maybe that was the first step, to stop waiting for the perfect answers and just take each moment as it came. Mark had been more distant than usual, his presence in the house like that of a shadow. There but not really there. Their interactions had become functional, like roommates who shared a space but nothing more. It wasn't a dramatic fallout. It was a quiet unraveling of something that had once been. The silence between them was not just a lack of words, but a lack of understanding, a lack of connection. That afternoon, when she walked into the kitchen, Mark was there, sipping his coffee, his gaze fixed on the floor. It was the first time in a long while that she felt the urge to speak. She wasn't sure what she would say or how she would even begin, but the words seemed to find her. "I think we need to talk," Samantha said, her voice softer than she intended. Mark looked up slowly, as if surprised that she was initiating a conversation. His expression was unreadable, but the fatigue in his eyes was unmistakable. "About what?" he asked, his voice hoarse, as though the silence between them had been his only companion. She walked over to the counter, leaning against it. "About everything," she said quietly. "About us. About what's happening. About the baby." His gaze darkened, and for a brief moment, the distance between them seemed to shrink, as if the walls that had grown so high between them could finally be brought down brick by brick. "I thought we weren't going to talk about that yet," he said, his tone guarded. "I can't avoid it anymore, Mark," Samantha replied. "It's not just about the baby. It's about everything that led to this point. I need to know where we go from here. What do we do now?" Mark set his coffee cup down with a gentle clink, his fingers drumming lightly against the ceramic. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice tinged with frustration. "I don't know what to do anymore. I don't know how to fix this." "How to fix us?" Samantha nodded slowly, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. "I don't know either. But I think we've been avoiding the truth for too long. And I'm tired of pretending that everything's fine when it's not." The tension in the room thickened, but it wasn't as suffocating as it had been before. There was a clarity now, a shared understanding that they couldn't keep avoiding the reality of their situation. They couldn't keep living in the shadows of what they had been. It was time to face it all head-on. "I don't want to leave," Mark said, his voice suddenly raw. "But I can't pretend that I'm okay with everything that's happened. I can't keep living in this house in this lie." Samantha swallowed hard, the truth stinging. "I know. I feel it too. I think we both know that it's time for a change. But I don't know what that looks like. Not yet." There was a long silence between them, the weight of their conversation settling into the space around them. Neither of them had the answers. Neither of them could undo what had been done. But they had to decide what came next. And that, Samantha realized, was where they were stuck, staring into the future, unsure of what path to take. "I think we need time," Samantha finally said, her voice trembling slightly. "Time to figure this out. Time to decide if we can even be who we were before all of this happened. If we can rebuild." Mark met her gaze, his eyes filled with pain but also something else, a flicker of hope, however faint. I can't promise anything, Sam. But I'm willing to try. If you are. Samantha nodded, the heaviness in her chest lifting just a fraction. I'm willing to try, she whispered, though she knew that rebuilding wasn't going to be easy. There were too many cracks in the foundation, too many things left unsaid. But it was a beginning, a starting point, and that, in itself, was something. Later that evening, as they sat together on the couch in silence, the soft glow of the lamp casting shadows over their faces, Samantha felt a quiet shift inside herself. The past couldn't be changed, and she wasn't sure what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she could breathe. The doorbell rang again, and this time it was Ethan. He stood there at the door, his expression as uncertain as hers had been when she first opened it to him. They hadn't talked since that night, and Samantha wasn't sure where things stood between them anymore. But there was something about the way his presence filled the space that made her heart race with anticipation and fear in equal measure. I wasn't sure if you'd still want to talk, Ethan said softly, his eyes searching hers for some sign of where they stood. Samantha hesitated for a moment before stepping aside, letting him in. She wasn't sure where this would lead, what it meant, but she knew one thing for certain. She was done pretending that everything was simple. Her feelings, her decisions, they were all complicated. And maybe, just maybe, she could figure it out in time. But for now, she needed to face the reality of everything, of Mark, of Ethan, and of what she truly wanted for herself and her future. As they sat together in the quiet of the house, the weight of their shared history and the uncertainty of what came next filled the room. But for the first time in a long time, Samantha felt ready to face it. She didn't have all the answers yet, but she was willing to find them. And in the quiet moments that followed, there was the faintest sense of peace, a quiet beginning, after so much uncertainty. As the days passed, Samantha tried to find a new rhythm, though it seemed the more she sought normalcy, the more tangled everything became. Conversations with Mark were still strained, but the air between them wasn't as thick as it had been. There was still discomfort, but they had both agreed to work through it. That alone was something. Ethan had kept his distance for a while after that night at the door, giving Samantha the space she needed. The silence that had enveloped their relationship was both a relief and a burden. She could feel the weight of his presence in the room every time he wasn't there, and yet every time they spoke, there was a quiet desperation in his voice. He wanted her to choose. He wanted clarity. But how could she give him something when she didn't even know what she wanted herself? Then one night, she sat alone in the kitchen after Mark had gone to bed, the house quiet save for the hum of the refrigerator. She stared at the untouched cup of coffee in front of her, her mind racing with fragments of thoughts that refused to align. The silence was a constant, lingering presence. She could hear her own heartbeat in the stillness, pulsing in time with the ache in her chest. She didn't know how to untangle this. The sudden ring of her phone broke the silence. It was Ethan. "Sam, are you okay?" he asked, his voice rough. She closed her eyes, feeling the familiar warmth of his concern seep through the phone. It was comforting and confusing at the same time. "I don't know, Ethan. I don't know if I'll ever be okay," she said, her voice shaky. There was a long pause, and when he spoke again, it was with the same gentle understanding that had always been part of his charm. "You don't have to have all the answers right now. You don't have to decide everything in one moment. But just know I'm here. Whatever you need." She could hear the honesty in his words, and for a moment, she let herself believe it. She wanted to believe it. But then, there was the reality of Mark and the life they had built. It wasn't easy to throw that all away. No matter how distant they had become, they still shared years of history, of moments that couldn't be erased. "I can't do this to Mark, Ethan," she whispered. "I can't just walk away from everything. It's not that simple." "I know," Ethan replied softly. "I'm not asking you to. I just want you to know that I'm here, Sam. I always will be." She let out a long breath, feeling the weight of his words press against her chest. "I don't know what to do. I don't know where this goes. I don't know anything." "I get it," Ethan said. "And I'll be here. Whenever you're ready." Samantha set the phone down, her hand trembling slightly. The emptiness in the room felt more pronounced now, heavier. She wanted to believe Ethan. She wanted to believe that things could be different between them. But there was a part of her that couldn't shake the guilt. The way Mark looked at her, the way she saw his pain when their eyes met. She was tangled between two realities, both of them equally uncertain and full of promise and pain. The next few days passed in a blur. Mark's work schedule had kept him busy, which left Samantha more time to herself than she had in a while. She began to fill the empty moments with walks, catching up on her reading, and trying to find some semblance of peace. It was hard, though. The house felt too quiet. The life she once knew felt like a distant memory, one she could still touch, but it didn't feel like it belonged to her anymore. One afternoon, after another quiet conversation with Mark that only scratched the surface of their issues, she found herself back at the park, the one where she and Ethan had spent so many afternoons together. The path was lined with old oak trees, their branches stretching wide, the leaves turning a brilliant gold with the change of the seasons. The air was crisp, and the world felt somehow quieter here. She walked along the path, letting the sounds of the birds and the wind filling the space around her. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she could breathe. But even then, there was a part of her that couldn't fully let go of the nagging feeling that something was wrong. She had left so much unresolved, so many questions unanswered. As if on cue, she saw him. Ethan was sitting on one of the park benches, looking out over the lake. His face was partially turned, but she could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hand gripped the edge of the bench. He looked up when he saw her approaching, and his face softened. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, hope, maybe. She didn't know what to say to him. "Sam," he said softly, standing as she approached. "Hey," she replied, forcing a smile. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said, his voice tentative. "I don't know why I came," she admitted, taking a seat on the bench next to him. They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the rustling of the leaves and the distant call of birds. Ethan didn't speak right away, giving her space to find the words. Samantha could feel the weight of their shared history, of everything that had come before and everything that might still be. "I don't want to hurt anyone, Ethan," she finally said, her voice shaky. "I don't want to choose between you and Mark. But I don't know how to keep pretending that nothing's wrong." "You don't have to pretend anymore," Ethan said, his voice gentle but firm. "You don't have to choose. Not yet. I'm not asking you to decide now. But I am asking you to be honest with yourself. What do you need, Sam?" Her heart raced in her chest. She wasn't sure if she could give him an answer. But for the first time in a long while, the answer didn't seem as elusive. She needed time. She needed to understand what she really wanted. And maybe, just maybe, she needed Ethan in her life again. But that didn't mean she could just walk away from Mark. It wasn't that simple. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But I'll figure it out. I promise." Ethan reached over, his hand resting on hers. There was a warmth in his touch, a reassurance that made her heart flutter. For a moment, she felt the stirrings of something she had forgotten, a sense of possibility. "I'm here," Ethan said softly, his thumb brushing over her hand. "Whenever you're ready. You don't have to carry this alone." Samantha nodded, taking a deep breath. She didn't know what the future held. But for now, she had Ethan's support, and that was something she could hold on to. Samantha sat in silence, the weight of Ethan's words heavy in her chest. His touch lingered, even after he had pulled his hand away. The simple gesture was comforting, yet it only served to remind her of how much she had allowed to go unsaid for so long. The distance she had placed between herself and her emotions was becoming harder to maintain. She had convinced herself that everything would settle, that she could somehow keep her life together. But sitting here, facing Ethan, with the echoes of her strained marriage still ringing in her ears, she knew that wasn't true. Ethan shifted beside her, sensing the quiet storm brewing within her. "You're not alone in this, Sam," he said again, his voice gentle but earnest. "You never have to be." She turned to look at him, his face open and vulnerable in a way she had never seen before. The uncertainty that had always been part of their connection was gone. In its place was something more, something raw and sincere. He wasn't just the man who had been her escape. He was the one who was offering her something real, something grounded in truth. "I just don't know how to fix this," she admitted, feeling the walls she'd built around her heart begin to crack. "I don't know how to fix me or us." "Maybe you don't need to fix anything right now," Ethan said quietly. "Maybe you just need to figure out what you want. And that's okay. You don't have to have all the answers right away." She nodded slowly, the weight in her chest lightening ever so slightly. The confusion that had clouded her thoughts for so long felt less suffocating in his presence. But there was still the looming question. What about Mark? How could she be so close to Ethan, so entangled in their past, and yet still feel like she was betraying her husband? The line between love, duty, and guilt had blurred beyond recognition. "I need to go home," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "I need to talk to Mark. I can't keep running from this." Ethan's expression softened, his hand brushing against hers once more. "I understand. But just know, Sam, whatever happens, I'm here. You don't have to face this alone. She squeezed his hand, a mixture of gratitude and sorrow filling her heart. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she couldn't keep living in limbo, trapped between two lives. The drive home was quiet. Samantha's mind was filled with the swirling emotions of the past few weeks, her marriage, her feelings for Ethan, and the unbearable weight of her own indecision. She could feel the tension in her shoulders as she gripped the steering wheel, trying to maintain control of the overwhelming swirl of thoughts. The streetlights blurred as she passed, their harsh glow a stark contrast to the soft warmth of the sun that had set hours ago. When she pulled into the driveway, she saw Mark's car parked outside. The familiar sight of it sent a wave of unease through her chest. This was it. The conversation she had been avoiding, the truth she had been afraid to confront, was now waiting for her on the other side of the door. Samantha took a deep breath before stepping out of the car. The cold air bit at her skin, but it didn't seem to register. Her mind was too full, too distracted by the internal conflict that had become her constant companion. As she walked up to the front door, she paused, looking at the house she had built with Mark. The memories, the laughter, the arguments, all of it was contained within these walls. Could she really throw it all away? She turned the doorknob and stepped inside. Mark was sitting on the couch, his head resting against the back as he stared blankly at the television. He didn't seem to notice her presence at first, lost in his own thoughts. But when he heard the door close behind her, he looked up. "Hey," he said softly, his voice tired. He looked at her with a kind of resignation that made her heart ache. "How was your day?" Samantha hesitated, feeling the weight of the moment. She didn't know how to start. She had rehearsed this in her mind, but now, with him sitting there, looking so familiar and distant at the same time, the words stuck in her throat. "Mark, we need to talk," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He sat up straighter, the shift in his posture immediate. He knew something was wrong. She could see it in the way his eyes narrowed, in the way his jaw clenched. "About what?" he asked, his voice more guarded now. Samantha took a seat across from him, gathering her thoughts. She could feel the tension building between them, thick and palpable. She had kept this secret for so long, buried it under the weight of their day-to-day life, but it was time. It was time for the truth. I've been seeing someone," she said, her voice shaking with the honesty that now poured out of her. "Ethan. I didn't mean for it to happen, but it did. And I don't know what to do." Mark's face went pale, the shock in his eyes quickly turning to hurt. His gaze dropped to the floor, and for a moment, the room was filled with nothing but the sound of his breath, ragged and uneven. "You've been seeing him?" he repeated, his voice trembling. "This whole time?" Samantha nodded, unable to look him in the eye. The shame weighed heavily on her, but she knew she couldn't hide from it anymore. "I never wanted to hurt you, Mark. I didn't know what I was doing. I was confused, lost," she said, her voice barely audible. "But I can't keep living like this. I can't keep pretending everything is okay when it's not." Mark ran a hand through his hair, the motion frustrated and defeated. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and disbelief. "I don't know what to say," he whispered. "I never saw this coming. You've been so distant, Sam. I didn't even know what was happening until it was too late." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had to face this, no matter how painful it was. "I'm sorry," she said again, her voice thick with emotion. "I never wanted to hurt you. I didn't know how to fix what was broken between us." Mark stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He turned away from her, pacing a few steps before stopping at the window, his back to her. "I need time to think," he said, his voice hoarse. I can't just process this in a moment. I need time, Sam." She nodded, feeling the weight of the silence between them grow even heavier. She had done this to them. She had brought this pain into their lives, and now there was no easy way out. She couldn't undo the damage she had done, but she had to hope somehow that they could both find a way forward. "I understand," she whispered, standing slowly. "I'll give you the space you need." As she turned to leave, Mark's voice stopped her. "Sam, do you still love him?" he asked, his voice tight with emotion. She froze, the question hanging in the air like a noose. "I don't know," she said softly, her voice breaking. "I don't know what love is anymore." The door closed behind her with a soft click, and she was left standing in the hallway, the weight of her choices pressing down on her. She didn't know what the future held. But she knew one thing for sure. Things could never go back to the way they were. Samantha stood in the hallway for a long moment, the faint scent of her husband's cologne lingering in the air. The house felt suffocating, the silence between them echoing louder than any words ever could. She had made her confession, laid her truth bare for Mark to see, and now there was nothing but the raw, gaping void of their broken connection. She had expected tears, anger, even bitterness, but the silence, it was almost worse. It felt like the end of something that had never truly been whole. She wanted to scream, to break the stillness with the chaos of her emotions. But all she could do was stand there, her fingers trembling as she clutched her coat tightly around her body. What had she done? Was it worth it? Would this be the thing that shattered everything, leaving no room for repair? The sound of the front door opening and closing broke her out of her thoughts, and she turned to see Mark walking past her, heading for the garage. He didn't look at her. He didn't say a word. Just walked away, his footsteps echoing through the empty house. Samantha swallowed hard, fighting the lump in her throat. She wanted to call after him, to beg for his forgiveness, but the words wouldn't come. What was there to say now? She had already said too much. She had already revealed the one thing that couldn't be undone. The air in the house was thick with tension. Every corner seemed to hold a memory of something better, of when they had been happy, when they had still believed in each other. But now it all felt so fragile, so easily broken. With a deep breath, Samantha turned and walked toward the stairs. She needed space to think, to figure out what her next step would be. She needed to clear her head, to find some semblance of peace in the chaos she had created. Upstairs, she stepped into their bedroom, a place where they had once shared quiet mornings and whispered secrets. Now it felt like a foreign place, an alien world filled with ghosts of what had been. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap as she stared at the empty space beside her. The silence in the room pressed against her chest, suffocating her. She had never felt so alone, even though she was surrounded by the remnants of their life together. The phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her. She pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was a message from Ethan. Her heart skipped a beat. "Are you okay?" it read. She stared at the message for a moment, the words burning through her mind like a flame. She had known this would happen. She had known that the moment she confessed to Mark, Ethan would be waiting for her to reach out. He had always been there for her, even when she had tried to push him away. But now everything was different. She knew she should ignore it. She should put the phone down, walk away, and give herself time to process everything. But instead, her fingers moved on their own accord. She typed out a response before she even realized what she was doing. "I don't know what to do. Everything's falling apart." The message sent before she could stop herself, and she immediately regretted it. She shouldn't have confided in him, not now. Not after everything that had happened. But then, almost instantly, his reply came. "I'm here for you, Sam. Whenever you need me. I'm not going anywhere." Her heart ached at his words. She had never wanted to hurt Mark, but now, with Ethan's message staring back at her, she realized how much she had allowed herself to lean on him. She had built something with Ethan, something that had felt so real, so vital, that it had blinded her to the consequences. And now, with Mark walking away, she couldn't help but feel like she had just lost everything. The tears came then, hot and heavy, spilling down her cheeks as she sat in the empty room. She had never felt so torn, so utterly lost. She didn't know where to go from here, what to do, or how to fix the mess she had made. All she knew was that nothing was ever going to be the same again. The next few days passed in a blur of emptiness. Samantha moved through the motions of daily life, but nothing felt real. Mark was distant, cold, and every attempt she made to talk to him was met with silence. He had shut himself off from her, and she could feel the walls between them growing higher and stronger. Ethan's messages continued, each one a lifeline in the sea of uncertainty. He was there for her, offering comfort, but she knew she couldn't keep relying on him. Not like this. She couldn't keep hiding behind the safety of his words. She had to face the reality of her marriage, of the damage she had caused. But the truth was, Samantha didn't know if Mark could ever forgive her. She didn't know if their marriage could survive this betrayal. And the thought of losing him, of losing everything they had built together, felt like a crushing weight on her chest. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't eat. Every moment was consumed by the guilt and regret that gnawed at her, eating away at the small shred of hope she had left. She had hurt him. She had betrayed him. And no matter how many times she told herself it was a mistake, the reality remained unchanged. One evening, after a long, silent dinner, Mark finally spoke. "I can't keep doing this, Sam," he said, his voice low and steady. "I can't keep pretending like nothing happened." Samantha's heart stopped. She looked up at him, her breath catching in her throat. "Mark, please." I need time, he said, his eyes never meeting hers. I need to figure out what I want. What we want. The words hit her like a physical blow. She had expected this, but hearing it out loud made it real. Her worst fear had come true. Mark was done, and she had no idea how to make it right. I love you, she whispered, her voice breaking. I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen. Mark stood up, pushing his chair back. I know you're sorry, Sam. But sometimes sorry isn't enough. And with that, he walked out of the room. Samantha sank into her chair, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of the table. It was over. She had ruined everything. And now there was no going back. Days turned into weeks, and the house grew colder. Mark barely spoke to her, and when he did, it was with the barest form of civility. She had no idea where things stood between them. Was there any chance of reconciliation? Or had their marriage already reached its breaking point? Ethan, too, seemed to sense the distance. He had stopped messaging her, giving her the space she had asked for. But it only made her more uncertain. She didn't know what she wanted anymore, or if there was a way to fix the mess she had made. All she knew was that she couldn't keep running from the truth. It was time to make a choice. It was late one evening when Mark finally came to her, his face tired and drawn, his eyes shadowed with the weight of everything they had been through. I've been thinking, he said, his voice rough. And I know things can't just go back to the way they were. But I'm willing to try. Samantha's heart leapt in her chest. What do you mean? I'm not saying it will be easy, Mark continued, his gaze never leaving hers. But I want to try. I want to fight for this. Tears welled in her eyes as she took a step forward, her heart pounding in her chest. You're willing to fight? He nodded slowly. Yes. For us. For you. And in that moment, Samantha realized that maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild. It wouldn't be easy and it would take time. But they had a chance. A chance to heal. A chance to start again. And for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to believe that everything wouldn't fall apart. That there was still hope. The next few days passed in a blur, the air between them charged with unspoken words and fragile hope. Samantha and Mark were like two people who had learned to walk again after a long, painful fall, each step tentative but determined. They didn't talk much, but the small gestures were enough, the way Mark made her coffee in the morning without her asking, the way Samantha found herself sitting closer to him on the couch as they watched TV, the way their hands brushed every so often as they passed in the kitchen. It wasn't much, but it was a start. But even as they tried to rebuild, there was still an invisible wall between them. Every smile felt strained, every moment of intimacy laced with the memory of the betrayal. And for Samantha, it was impossible to forget the pain in Mark's eyes when he had confronted her. She had broken his trust, and no matter how many times she apologized, it didn't seem like enough. Yet each day they both seemed to inch closer to something resembling normalcy. The silence that had once been suffocating began to feel more comfortable, like a heavy blanket they were learning to move beneath. One evening, a few weeks after their conversation about trying to make it work, Samantha came home to find Mark sitting at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a glass of whiskey. The sight of him like this, a man caught in the weariness of his thoughts, made her heart ache. It was a stark reminder of how far they had fallen. She stood in the doorway for a moment, unsure of how to approach him. The tension in the room felt thick, but it was different now, almost softer, as if they had already crossed the hardest part and were simply waiting for the dust to settle. "Mark?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't immediately look up, but she could see the subtle tightening of his shoulders as he heard her voice. He took a slow sip of his drink, his fingers tracing the rim of the glass before he finally met her eyes. "I'm sorry," Samantha said, her voice trembling. "I never meant to hurt you. I didn't know what I was doing." Mark set the glass down with a soft clink, his eyes never leaving hers. "I know you didn't," he said quietly. "But that doesn't change the fact that you did." The words stung, but they were also a reminder that he wasn't ready to just forgive her yet. And she didn't expect him to be. The road to healing wasn't going to be quick or easy. "I don't know if we'll ever get back to the way things were," he continued, his voice rough. "But I want to try, Sam. For both of us." Tears filled her eyes at his words, not because they were easy to hear, but because they were the truth. They both wanted this, wanted to heal, wanted to find their way back to each other, but it wasn't going to happen overnight. "I'm willing to fight for it," Samantha said, stepping closer to him. "I don't want to lose you. Not now, not ever." Mark didn't say anything for a moment, and the silence between them felt charged with years of emotion. Finally, he stood up slowly, closing the distance between them. I'm willing to fight too, he said, his voice low and steady. But it's going to take time. We both need to be patient with each other. Samantha nodded, her heart pounding in her chest as she reached out for him. When his arms wrapped around her, she felt the weight of their shared history, the pain, the betrayal, the years of love that had been threatened by a single mistake. But in that moment, she also felt something else. Hope. A small, fragile seed, but a seed nonetheless. They stood there in the quiet of the kitchen, holding each other. Neither of them spoke, but neither of them needed to. The distance between them, though still present, felt smaller now. The walls that had once seemed insurmountable were beginning to crumble, piece by piece. And for the first time in a long time, Samantha believed that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. Over the next several weeks, Mark and Samantha continued their tentative steps forward. They spoke more openly about their feelings, about what had gone wrong and what they needed from each other. There were still moments of tension, still days when the weight of their past mistakes threatened to pull them under, but they learned to navigate those moments together. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. One weekend, they decided to take a trip, a small getaway to the coast, a place they had visited together early in their marriage. It had always been a special spot for them, a place where they had shared countless memories. The idea of going back felt like a small but meaningful step toward rediscovering each other. As they sat on the beach, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Samantha couldn't help but feel a sense of peace settle over her. The sea stretched out before them, vast and endless, much like the road ahead. There was so much left to repair, so many mistakes to atone for, but there was also something else, a sense of possibility. "I'm sorry for everything," Samantha said quietly, her voice barely audible over the sound of the waves. Mark turned to her, his eyes soft. "You've said it 100 times already." "I know," she said, her voice cracking. "But I need you to know that I mean it. I never meant for any of this to happen. I love you, Mark. And I want to be better. I want to make things right." Mark reached for her hand, his fingers curling around hers. "I know, Sam. And I'm trying too. I can't promise it will be easy, but I promise I'm in this with you." They sat in silence for a while, the waves crashing softly at their feet. The night was cool, the air tinged with the scent of salt and seaweed. It was a simple moment, but it felt like a victory. A small one, but a victory nonetheless. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Samantha allowed herself to believe that they could make it. That they could rebuild. That love, though fragile, could survive the storm. It wouldn't be easy. It would take time. But as they sat there, side by side, with the world stretching out before them, she knew that as long as they were together, they had a chance. A chance to start again. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The following months weren't without their struggles. Each day, Samantha and Mark faced their own demons, insecurities, fears, and moments of doubt, but there was a quiet resilience that had begun to take root between them. They weren't perfect. They still had their arguments, still questioned the path they were on, but there was also something more. Understanding. Samantha had learned to listen. Mark had learned to speak without fear of being misunderstood. Slowly but surely, they began to build something new, something more solid than what had existed before. The cracks in their relationship, though still there, were no longer sharp and jagged. Instead, they were smoothed over with time and effort. They spent evenings talking about the future, about the life they hoped to create together. It wasn't about grand gestures or sweeping promises. It was about the small, everyday things, the quiet mornings where they shared a cup of coffee, the nights spent curled up on the couch watching movies, the simple joy of each other's company. One day, as they were walking through the park, Mark took Samantha's hand in his and pulled her to a stop. "Sam," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I need you to know something." She looked up at him, her heart racing. "What is it?" Mark took a deep breath, his fingers tightening around hers. "I know we've been through a lot, and I know there's still work to do. But I love you. And I don't just love you for the good times, I love you for the bad times too. For everything we've been through. And I'm willing to fight for us, no matter what." Tears welled in Samantha's eyes as she gazed at him, her heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and love. "Mark, I don't deserve you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, you do," he said, brushing a stray tear from her cheek. "You deserve everything. And I'm going to make sure you know that, every single day." They stood there for a long time in the quiet of the park, the world moving around them while they remained still, locked in a moment of pure, simple truth. In that moment, Samantha knew that no matter what came their way, they would face it together. They were no longer the same people they had been when the affair had torn them apart. They had changed, grown, and learned from their mistakes. And while their journey wasn't over, they were on the same path side by side. Time continued its relentless march, but Samantha and Mark no longer feared it. They no longer feared what the future held. They had learned that the only thing that mattered was the present, the here and now. They had a chance, a real chance, to make things work. And as long as they had each other, that was enough. And so they moved forward one step at a time together. It was a year later, on the same park bench where Mark had confessed his unwavering love, that Samantha sat, waiting for him. The sun had begun to set, casting the sky in warm golden hues. She had a small box in her hand, the contents hidden from view, but her heart was racing with anticipation. When Mark finally appeared, walking toward her with that familiar smile, something inside her shifted. They had been through so much, and yet here they were, standing at the threshold of something new, something solid, something worth holding on to. "Hey," he said, sitting down next to her, his hand instinctively reaching for hers. "Hey," she replied, her voice soft. "I've been thinking." Mark raised an eyebrow, glancing at the box in her hands. "About what?" Samantha took a deep breath, her fingers curling around the edges of the box. "About us. About how far we've come. I'm proud of us," he said quietly. "We've fought hard, Sam." She nodded, her gaze dropping to the box in her hands. "I know, and I want to keep fighting. I want to keep building this with you." Mark's eyes softened. "You know I'm right here, right? I'm not going anywhere." Samantha smiled, her heart swelling. She took his hand and placed the box in his lap. "I know, and I want to give you something." Mark looked down at the box, then back at her, confusion flickering across his face. "What is it?" Samantha swallowed hard, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "It's a promise. A promise that I'm not giving up on us. That I'm not going anywhere either." Mark's eyes grew wide as he opened the box, revealing a simple silver key. He looked up at her, his voice barely a whisper. "A key." Samantha nodded. "To our future. To the life we're going to build. It's a symbol that, no matter what comes our way, we have each other. And we'll keep unlocking doors together." Tears filled Mark's eyes as he reached out to pull her into a tight embrace. "I love you, Sam," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I love you too," she whispered back, her heart full. In that moment, the world around them seemed to pause. They had made it. They had survived the storm, and now they were standing in the light. The key in Mark's hand was more than just a simple object. It was a promise, a symbol of their strength, their love, and the future they would continue to build side by side. And for the first time in a long time, Samantha believed in the possibility of a happy ending. The weeks that followed were quiet but full of meaning. Samantha and Mark didn't rush to make big changes. Instead, they took their time, learning how to truly rebuild their relationship. They made small adjustments to their routines, carving out moments to simply be together, away from the pressures of their past. The focus wasn't on erasing what had happened, but on building something new and stronger from it. They moved back into their shared apartment, though it felt different this time. They no longer saw it as a place of tension, but as a space where they could create new memories. The old, familiar ache of betrayal still lingered in the corners of their minds, but they had learned to confront it, to acknowledge it without letting it define them. Mark kept his promises. He made efforts in ways that surprised Samantha. When he came home from work, he would surprise her with her favorite dinner, or a walk in the park, or a simple, spontaneous act of kindness that made her heart flutter. He was constantly reminding her of his love, not through grand gestures, but through consistency. One evening, as they sat on the couch together, Mark turned to her with a serious look in his eyes. "Sam," he began, his voice soft but steady, "I know we've been through a lot, but I don't want you to ever doubt that I'm all in. You and me, whatever this is now, I'm committed." Samantha felt a lump form in her throat as she looked at him, the weight of his words settling deep in her chest. She had spent so much time wondering whether he truly meant it, whether this was just another attempt to make things right. But now, she could see the sincerity in his eyes. The man sitting in front of her wasn't the same one who had made mistakes in the past. This was a man who had learned, grown, and was now ready to show up in a way he hadn't before. "I don't ever want to doubt you again," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "But I can't promise it'll be easy. I can't promise I won't have moments of fear." "I know," Mark said, gently squeezing her hand. "And I don't need you to promise anything. All I ask is that you give me a chance to prove it, that we both keep trying, no matter what." Samantha nodded, feeling a wave of gratitude wash over her. She didn't have all the answers. She didn't know what the future held. But in that moment, she knew they were on the right path. Together. The healing didn't happen overnight, but with time, they found a rhythm. The small, shared moments became the glue that held them together. They discovered a new intimacy, one built not on the rush of passion, but on the slow, steady warmth of genuine connection. They spoke about their hopes, their fears, their dreams, not in grand declarations, but in quiet exchanges that grew more meaningful with each passing day. Then came the day when they both knew, without needing to say it aloud, that they had crossed a threshold. It wasn't about forgiveness anymore. It was about moving forward, together, with the knowledge that they had both played a part in their journey and that they were stronger for it. And so, Samantha and Mark began the next chapter of their lives, not as two people trying to erase the past, but as two people who had learned to embrace it, flaws and all. They had discovered that love wasn't about perfection. It was about showing up, being present, and continuing to choose each other every day. Years later, as they stood together, watching the sunset from the same park where Mark had first shared his promise to her, Samantha knew one thing for sure. No matter what came their way, they had already proven to themselves that love was worth fighting for. And that was enough. The years rolled by, the scars from the past slowly fading, though not entirely disappearing. Samantha and Mark continued to learn from their mistakes, growing individually and as a couple. They traveled together, visited new places, and tried new things. Their relationship was no longer defined by betrayal, but by the strength they had found in each other. They had become partners in every sense of the word, supporting each other through the highs and lows. On their 5-year anniversary, Mark took Samantha to the very same spot where they had shared their first truly honest conversation after everything had come to light. The air was warm, and the sky above them was painted with hues of pink and orange, the kind of sunset that seemed to promise the start of something new. Samantha looked at him, her heart full, her eyes meeting his with the kind of understanding that only comes from shared history. Mark reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, opening it to reveal a delicate gold ring. She gasped, her breath catching in her throat as she stared at the symbol of everything they had rebuilt. "Samantha," Mark began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I know we've been through a lot, and I know it hasn't always been easy. But these past 5 years with you have been the happiest of my life. I don't ever want to take that for granted. Will you marry me? Again?" Samantha's eyes welled up with tears as she looked at him, her heart overflowing with love. It wasn't the grand gesture she had once expected, but it was perfect. The simplicity of the moment, the quiet sincerity behind his words, meant more to her than anything. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I will." And so, standing there in the fading light, surrounded by the love and the memories they had built, they made a new promise to each other. A promise not just to love, but to continue growing, to continue choosing each other day by day. As they walked back to their car, hand in hand, they knew that their journey wasn't over, but it was one they would face together. No matter what the future held, they had already learned the most important lesson. That love, when nurtured with trust, patience, and understanding, could withstand even the hardest of storms. They didn't need to know the details of the future. They didn't need to have it all figured out. What mattered was that they were in it together, and that was enough. The years ahead would undoubtedly bring new challenges, but for now they were content. The past had shaped them, yes, but it no longer controlled them. Together, they had found a new beginning, and that was something worth celebrating. With the soft hum of the city behind them and the warmth of their love surrounding them, they headed home, ready for whatever came next, knowing that as long as they had each other, they could face anything. And in that moment, that was all that mattered. Samantha smiled, glancing at Mark as they pulled into their driveway. She was ready for the rest of their story, ready to write the chapters that would follow. And for the first time in a long while, she knew that whatever came next, it would be a story worth telling. As the days turned into weeks, the happiness that Samantha and Mark had found together began to settle into a quiet routine. They laughed more easily now, their conversations filled with inside jokes and shared memories. They no longer walked on eggshells around each other, but instead walked hand in hand, side by side in the truest sense. Mark was more present, having realized just how much he had taken Samantha for granted in the past. He no longer distracted himself with work or the empty noise of his phone. He took time to listen, to truly see her. And she did the same for him, understanding that his vulnerability had always been buried beneath layers of pride and fear. The walls between them, which had once felt insurmountable, had come down. Slowly, steadily, they had built something stronger, something lasting. One afternoon, Samantha found herself staring at the ring Mark had given her, turning it over in her fingers as she sat in the quiet of their living room. It felt heavier now, not because of the gold or the diamonds, but because of the weight of the promise it held. She had never imagined this would be her life, the one she had now, but she couldn't deny that it felt right. In her heart, she knew that whatever had brought them to this point was worth every tear, every hurt, every setback. The thought of their future together filled her with a quiet hope. She didn't need perfection anymore. She had learned that love was not about grand gestures or flawless moments. It was about staying, even when the storms raged, and finding each other on the other side. One evening, as they sat together in the warmth of their home, Mark put his arm around her, pulling her close. The TV hummed softly in the background, but they weren't really watching. The weight of their shared past and their present peace hung between them, a reminder of how far they had come. "I'm sorry," Mark said, his voice soft and full of sincerity. Samantha looked up at him, her heart warming. She didn't need to ask what he was apologizing for. She already knew. "I never meant to hurt you, Sam. I thought I could fix everything on my own. I didn't realize I needed to let you in. I'm sorry for the distance I created between us." Samantha smiled, brushing her hand across his cheek. "I know, and I know you're sorry. It's taken a lot for both of us, hasn't it?" He nodded, pressing his forehead against hers. "Yeah, but we've got each other now, and I'll do whatever it takes to keep it that way." For the first time in a long while, Samantha truly believed him. It wasn't about forgetting the past, but about building a future that would make it worthwhile. They had both made mistakes, and they had both suffered, but together, they had learned what it meant to truly forgive. To rebuild not just trust, but a love that was more genuine, more real than it had ever been. The next few months passed quietly, filled with more moments of clarity and connection. They took weekend trips to explore new places, visited old friends, and found ways to rediscover the joy they had once felt. They weren't trying to fix everything that had been broken. They were simply building on the foundation they had now. Samantha had begun to think of their love story not as a tragic tale of infidelity, but as a journey of transformation. She could look at Mark now without bitterness or resentment. She saw him for who he was, the man who had stumbled, yes, but who had also tried, who had learned, who had loved her in his own flawed way. And that was enough. On a quiet evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset, Samantha's hand found Mark's, the two of them silent for a while as they listened to the sounds of the evening. The gentle rustling of the trees, the chirping of crickets, the soft sigh of the breeze. Everything was calm, everything felt settled. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if we hadn't gone through all of that?" Samantha asked, her voice almost a whisper, as though afraid to break the peace. Mark looked at her, his gaze steady and thoughtful. "Sometimes," he said, "but I don't think we would have gotten here without it. The pain, the mistakes, the struggle. It brought us to a better place. Not a perfect place, but a real one." Samantha smiled, squeezing his hand gently. "Yeah, I think you're right." And as they sat there, watching the sky change from pink to purple, from purple to deep blue, Samantha realized something. The journey wasn't just about overcoming the hurt, it was about finding the strength to move forward together. And they had done that. They had both grown, both healed, and now they had the chance to make their future the one they had always dreamed of. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy, but it was theirs. And that was enough. Samantha leaned her head on Mark's shoulder, and together, they watched the stars begin to dot the night sky, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it hand in hand. And for the first time in a long time, she felt ready for whatever the future held. The following weeks seemed to pass in a blur, each day more peaceful than the last. Samantha had begun to see the quiet beauty in the simplicity of their life, a life that had once been overshadowed by regret and pain, but was now filled with quiet joy. They had learned to appreciate the little things again, the way Mark made her coffee in the mornings, how they laughed about nothing and everything at the same time, the way he held her at night, just to make sure she was there, and that he was too. In the quiet spaces between their conversations, they found a new kind of intimacy. It wasn't just about the big moments anymore, the ones that would steal their breath away, but the quiet, comfortable ones that showed up in the day-to-day. The shared glances, the moments of touch, the tender smiles that spoke of an understanding deeper than words could express. Mark continued to work on himself, finding ways to improve, to be present in ways he had never been before. He became more patient, more considerate, not just with Samantha, but with the world around him. He understood now how much it mattered to show up, not just physically but emotionally. To let someone in, to trust them with your heart, to share your thoughts without fear. He wasn't perfect, but he was trying, and that meant everything to Samantha. And then, as the months passed, an unexpected sense of calm began to settle between them. The chaos of their past, the tremors of betrayal and hurt, had been replaced with something more solid. There was no rushing to rebuild everything in one grand gesture. Instead, they had built it piece by piece, slowly, carefully, and with more love than they had ever imagined they were capable of. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, sharing a quiet dinner and an old movie, Mark turned to Samantha, his expression more serious than usual. The flicker of the television cast soft shadows across his face, and his gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than usual. "I've been thinking about us," he said, his voice quiet but earnest. "About everything we've been through. How we've gotten to this point." Samantha paused, her fork hovering in midair, looking at him with a gentle curiosity. She set it down slowly and looked into his eyes, seeing the weight of his words, the sincerity in them. "Do you regret it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The question hung between them, full of a quiet fear, a fear of the truth that might shatter everything they had built. Samantha didn't answer right away. Instead, she leaned back, her eyes softening as she thought. She had never truly allowed herself to regret the path they had taken. Sure, there were moments of hurt, moments when she wondered what their lives might have been like if they hadn't gone through the pain they had. But regret was not the word she would choose. Regret felt too heavy, too final. "No," she said at last, her voice steady and warm. "I don't regret it. I don't regret us. We're here, and that's all that matters. We had to go through everything to get here, Mark. And now, I can look at you and feel peace. I can look at you and feel love. The real kind, not the kind that's weighed down with bitterness." His face softened, a mixture of relief and gratitude washing over him. He had spent so much time wondering if Samantha would ever be able to fully forgive him, wondering if their love could truly survive the betrayal. But hearing her say it, hearing her truly believe it, made him feel like they had a future together again. A real one. "I love you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Samantha smiled, her heart swelling with the depth of his words. "I love you too," she replied, her hand finding his, their fingers intertwining. And in that moment, the past didn't matter. The mistakes, the heartache, the missteps, they were nothing compared to the promise of what they had now. What they had built together. Weeks later, Samantha and Mark stood side by side in the park, watching as their friends and family gathered around them. The sun was setting, casting golden hues over the grass, and the atmosphere was warm, the air fragrant with the scent of summer. Samantha felt Mark's hand slip into hers, his touch grounding and steady. They had never imagined a moment like this, after everything that had happened, after all the pain. Here they were, ready to start something new. They were no longer two people burdened by past mistakes, but two people who had healed, who had rebuilt their love, who had found a way to forgive, to grow, and to move forward. As the ceremony began, they exchanged vows, their voices steady and sure. They spoke of their past, their present, and their future, a future they were no longer afraid to imagine. "I promise to stand by you, even in the hardest of times," Mark said, his voice full of emotion. "I promise to love you with everything I have for as long as I can." Samantha's heart swelled as she spoke her own vows. "I promise to never give up on us. I promise to always choose you, no matter what life throws our way. Because I know now, after everything we've been through, that we are stronger than we ever thought possible. And I choose to love you." As they exchanged rings, the world around them seemed to fade. The ceremony, the guests, the setting sun, they were all distant, replaced by the truth in their hearts. They had made it, together. The applause that followed felt like the final affirmation of everything they had fought for. Samantha and Mark were no longer defined by their mistakes, but by their commitment to each other, their willingness to fight for the love they had. And in that moment they knew, without a doubt, that they had made the right choice. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy. There would be more challenges, more moments of doubt, more struggles. But for the first time in a long time, they both felt ready to face whatever came next together. And as the evening stretched into night, with the stars twinkling above them, Samantha leaned into Mark, her heart full, her spirit lighter than it had been in years. "We did it," she whispered, looking up at him, her eyes filled with quiet joy. "Yeah," Mark replied, his voice thick with emotion. "We did." And together, they walked into the future, hand in hand, ready for whatever it might bring. As the days turned into weeks, Samantha and Mark settled into their new rhythm, their bond strengthening with each passing day. The past had its lingering shadows, but they no longer defined them. The time spent together, the small moments of understanding and shared laughter, were far more significant now than the mistakes they had made or the hurt they had endured. Their relationship was not perfect, but it was real, and that was all that mattered. They spent weekends exploring the city, rediscovering places they had once visited together, and finding new spots that felt like their own. They visited the old cafe on the corner where they had their first date, sitting in the same booth by the window, sharing quiet conversations over coffee. It was small gestures like these that made their love feel more alive than ever. Each step forward was a silent testament to their resilience, and with each new day, they found new layers of their relationship to enjoy. Mark, who had once been consumed by guilt and regret, now found peace in being present. He made it his mission to show Samantha that he was here for her, not just in words, but in actions. He became more attuned to her needs, to her desires, and to the unspoken things that made her feel seen and loved. He made her breakfast on weekends, ran errands without being asked, and made it a point to plan date nights, even if it was just a walk in the park or a quiet dinner at home. Samantha, too, had changed. She had come to terms with her own vulnerabilities and had learned to trust Mark again, not just with her heart, but with her fears and insecurities. She began to let go of the walls she had built around herself, opening up to him in ways she had never allowed herself before. The laughter came easier now, and the tears, when they came, were no longer laced with resentment. They were just another part of their healing. As they navigated this new chapter of their relationship, they learned that love wasn't about perfection. It was about growth, acceptance, and the willingness to be vulnerable with one another. It was about understanding that both people in a relationship were constantly evolving, and it was the effort to grow together, despite the challenges, that made love last. Mark's commitment to Samantha was unwavering. He understood that words alone weren't enough. He had to prove his love through actions. And though the scars from their past would never fully disappear, they had learned to live with them. The pain had shaped them, but it didn't define their future. One rainy afternoon, as they sat on the couch wrapped in blankets, watching the rain trickle down the windows, Mark turned to Samantha with a thoughtful expression. "Do you think we'll ever be able to fully put the past behind us?" he asked, his voice soft. Samantha thought for a moment, then shook her head, a small smile playing on her lips. "I don't think we can ever completely forget what happened," she said, her voice steady but kind. "But I think we can choose to let it go. We can choose to build something new, something better." Mark nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. "And we will," he said quietly, together. And with that, they sat in silence, the world outside falling away as they found solace in the quiet comfort of each other's presence. Their journey was far from over, but they had made it this far. Together, they had faced the hardest parts, and as long as they had each other, they knew they could face whatever came next. Samantha rested her head on Mark's shoulder, her heart full. There was no need for grand gestures anymore. Their love had found its place in the simplicity of the everyday, in the shared moments, and in the quiet assurance that no matter what, they would always choose each other. And that, in the end, was enough. As the days passed, their lives began to take on a quiet kind of rhythm, one that felt less like surviving and more like living. Their moments together became more meaningful, their connection deeper. There were still awkward silences, still misunderstandings here and there, but each one was a reminder that they were no longer stuck in the past. They were moving forward. Samantha found herself laughing more often. She hadn't realized how much she had missed the sound of genuine laughter until it flowed so freely between them again. The weight she had carried for so long, the burden of betrayal and disappointment, began to feel lighter as she allowed herself to embrace the present, without the constant fear of it all falling apart. One Saturday evening, they took a walk through the park near their apartment. The air was cool, and the sky was streaked with the last remnants of the sunset. The colors melted into the darkening sky, and the world felt still, as if holding its breath. Samantha slipped her hand into Mark's, their fingers intertwining naturally. "I've been thinking," Samantha said quietly, her gaze fixed on the path ahead. "Maybe it's time we stop looking back." Mark squeezed her hand, his voice low but steady. "I agree. We can't keep carrying all of that with us." "It's hard to let go," she confessed, her voice tinged with vulnerability. "But I know we can't keep living in the past if we want a future together." Mark nodded, the streetlights casting soft glows around them as they walked. "We've already come so far. I think we're ready for the next step, whatever that looks like. There was a deep silence between them, one that wasn't awkward or uncomfortable, but one that spoke of mutual understanding. A shared recognition of the work they had done, the battles they had fought, and the love they had found again, even through the hardest of times. When they reached a bench by the pond, they sat down, the night settling around them like a blanket. The only sounds were the distant murmur of the city and the occasional rustling of leaves. It felt like the world had paused just for them. Samantha leaned her head on Mark's shoulder, a small sigh escaping her. "I'm not sure what the future holds," she said softly, "but I think I'm ready to face it. With you." Mark rested his cheek against her hair, his breath steady. "I don't know what's next either," he admitted. "But I know we'll face it together. We've learned how to do that, haven't we?" Samantha smiled, closing her eyes. "We have. And I think we'll keep learning." The evening passed quietly, the peace they found in each other's presence enough to fill the silence. There were no grand promises spoken, no guarantees, just an understanding that they were in this together, that they had survived the storm, and now they could begin to build something new. As they walked back to their apartment, the streets now bathed in the soft glow of the moonlight, Samantha couldn't help but feel a sense of hope blossoming in her chest. It wasn't a promise of perfection, nothing was ever perfect, but it was a promise of trying, of rebuilding, of living with the scars but not letting them define them. And as they reached the door of their apartment, Mark paused before opening it. He turned to her, his eyes soft yet steady. "I love you, Samantha." Her heart swelled at the words, and for the first time in a long while, she truly believed them. "I love you too," she replied, her voice steady, confident. They entered the apartment together, the weight of the world lifted off their shoulders, the future now a blank page waiting to be written. And as they sat down to a simple meal, no longer burdened by the past, Samantha realized that they had already begun to write their new chapter, one full of love, resilience, and the promise of a future built on the foundation of trust. Their love story wasn't over. In fact, it was only just beginning. And for the first time, both of them felt ready for whatever came next. The weeks that followed felt like they were slowly building the foundation of something stronger than what they had before. Mark and Samantha found a new rhythm, one that wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. They discovered small things about each other that had been lost in the storm, tiny moments of tenderness and kindness that had been overshadowed by the chaos of the past. It wasn't just about grand gestures anymore. It was in the little things. Mark cooking dinner when she was too tired, or Samantha sending him a text in the middle of the day just to tell him she loved him. They began to trust each other in ways they hadn't for a long time. Samantha's work had become a source of both pride and stress, but Mark was always there, listening to her vent after a difficult day. He didn't try to fix things, didn't try to solve everything, but his presence, his quiet support, meant more than any words ever could. One evening, after a long day of work, Samantha returned home to find the apartment filled with the scent of freshly baked bread. Mark had been busy, and as she walked in, he looked up from the kitchen with a smile that melted the exhaustion from her shoulders. "I figured you could use a break," he said, wiping his hands on a dish towel. She smiled, genuinely this time, her fatigue forgotten in an instant. "You're spoiling me," she teased, walking over to him. He shrugged, a playful glint in his eye. "I'm just trying to keep up with you." They sat down to eat, talking about their days, the small victories, the minor annoyances. It was a simple dinner, but it was the kind of dinner that felt like home, comfortable, safe, and real. Later that night, after the dishes were done and the apartment was quiet again, Samantha sat by the window, gazing out at the city lights. The rain had started to fall gently outside, and the soft patter against the glass made everything feel even more peaceful. Mark joined her, sitting down beside her and wrapping an arm around her shoulders. He didn't say anything at first, just held her close as the silence enveloped them. "Do you ever think about the future?" she asked after a while, her voice soft. "Every day," he replied. "But mostly I think about what we've built so far. The rest can wait." Samantha leaned her head against his chest, a content sigh escaping her. "I like that. I think we're starting to get it right." Mark smiled, kissing the top of her head. "I think so too." And in that moment, with the rain falling outside and the quiet of the apartment surrounding them, Samantha felt a warmth inside her, a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. Maybe the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but as long as they had each other, she felt ready for whatever came next. They spent the evening together, talking, laughing, and making small plans for the future. It wasn't about grand declarations or promises that couldn't be kept. It was just about being present, right here in the moment. As the night deepened and the rain stopped, they made their way to bed. Samantha curled up next to Mark, her hand finding his in the darkness. It wasn't the perfect ending to the perfect day, but it was theirs and it felt enough. Tomorrow would come with its own challenges, but for tonight they were safe. And for the first time in a long time, Samantha truly believed in their future, whatever it looked like and however long it took. Together they would face it. The light of the new day would always be just over the horizon, waiting for them to step into it together. The days continued to drift by with an almost surreal sense of normalcy. The cracks in their relationship had been filled in with patience and tenderness, but deep down, Samantha knew that the past couldn't be erased. She had let go of much of the anger, but there were days when it still surfaced unexpectedly, a reminder that things hadn't always been this calm. Yet those moments were fewer now. She found herself smiling more, laughing without the weight of guilt or resentment hanging over her. She looked at Mark differently now, less as the person she had resented, and more as the one who had been a part of her life for so long. He wasn't perfect, and neither was she, but together, they were finding their way through the mess they had created. There was something about the mundane moments that had begun to feel like a quiet victory. They still argued sometimes, still disagreed on trivial things, but those moments felt like a far cry from the endless cycles of silence and frustration that had once defined them. Now, even the smallest gestures, Mark leaving a note on the kitchen counter before he went to work, Samantha planning a spontaneous dinner out for them, felt like pieces of a puzzle slowly coming together. Mark had a way of surprising her. He wasn't the spontaneous, grand gesture type of man, but there were times when he would do something unexpectedly thoughtful, like bringing home flowers or planning an impromptu movie night, just to remind her that he was present. She had to admit, she liked the quiet reassurance that their relationship was no longer teetering on the edge of collapse. One Sunday morning, they woke up early, the sun just beginning to rise over the city skyline. Mark was already up making coffee, his silhouette outlined by the soft light filtering through the curtains. Samantha watched him for a moment before slipping out of bed, drawn to the warmth of the kitchen. "Morning," she murmured, leaning against the counter, watching him move around the space with a quiet purpose. "Morning," he replied, turning to flash a sleepy smile. "I made coffee. Thought you might like some." "I do," she said with a soft smile, accepting the mug he handed her. "Thank you." They sipped their coffee in silence for a moment, the only sound between them the gentle hum of the city outside. There was something peaceful about these mornings, something that made everything feel simpler, easier. The tension had left their lives, leaving only the quiet hum of connection. Mark set his mug down, leaning against the counter. "I was thinking," he started, looking over at her, "maybe we should plan a trip, just the two of us. A weekend away." Samantha raised an eyebrow, surprised by the suggestion. "A trip? Just the two of us?" He nodded, a small grin on his face. "Yeah, we've been so caught up in everything work, life, trying to fix what was broken. I think it might be good for us to get away, just the two of us, and really focus on, well, us." She studied him for a moment, a mixture of surprise and appreciation in her gaze. "I think that sounds really nice," she said slowly, smiling softly. "I didn't think you'd be the type to suggest something like that." Mark shrugged, looking a little embarrassed. "I guess I've been thinking about it for a while. I think we've both been so caught up in the past that we've forgotten what it's like to just enjoy each other's company." Samantha's heart warmed at his words, and she took a step toward him. "You're right. I've been thinking the same thing. A weekend away sounds perfect." And just like that, things felt a little lighter. There was something about the idea of getting away together, away from the reminders of their struggles, that seemed to promise a new chapter. Maybe not a perfect one, but one filled with the possibility of rediscovery. Over the next few days, they planned their trip, picking out a small cabin in the mountains, far from the chaos of the city. The anticipation of the getaway, the simplicity of the plan, became a welcome distraction. It gave them something to look forward to, something that didn't have to be fixed or complicated, just two people escaping for a while, to see what might be waiting for them. As the day of their departure approached, Samantha couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement. This wasn't about solving their problems, it was about taking a step forward together. They weren't running away from their issues, but they were giving themselves a chance to breathe, to reconnect in a way they hadn't in a long time. The drive was long, but it was peaceful. The mountains grew closer with each passing mile, the landscape shifting from the concrete jungle of the city to the calming green of the hills. The air smelled different here, fresher, cleaner. The kind of air that made her feel like she could finally let go of the weight she had carried for so long. The cabin they rented was rustic but charming. It was tucked away at the edge of the woods, surrounded by towering trees and a small stream that ran behind it. There was no phone signal, no distractions, just the two of them, the sounds of nature and the soft crackle of the fire in the fireplace. Samantha took a deep breath as she stepped out of the car, inhaling the crisp mountain air. It felt like a world away from the city, a world away from everything. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt like she could exhale. "I think we made the right choice," Mark said, glancing at her as he unloaded their bags from the trunk. "This place is perfect." "It really is," she agreed, her eyes scanning the surrounding forest. There was something serene about it, something that made her feel small in the best way possible. She had always been drawn to nature, to the quiet moments when everything else faded away. They spent the evening settling in, exploring the cabin, and then cooking dinner together. It felt natural, like old times, when they were just two people enjoying each other's company. They talked easily, laughed, and made small plans for the next few days. It wasn't about trying to fix everything, it was just about being present with each other, no expectations. The following days were a blur of quiet moments, long walks through the forest, and stargazing late into the night. They talked about everything and nothing, memories of their first meeting, their favorite songs, the dreams they had once shared. It wasn't a perfect getaway, but it was perfect for them. Every day felt like a step toward something better, something more hopeful. By the time their trip came to an end, neither of them wanted to leave. The mountains, the quiet, the simplicity, it all felt like the escape they had needed. They weren't leaving behind their problems, but for the first time, they were facing them from a different perspective. And that, Samantha realized, was exactly what they needed. As they drove back to the city, Mark reached over, his hand finding hers on the armrest. He didn't say anything at first, just held her hand in the same quiet way he always had. But this time, there was no tension in the air. No unresolved feelings hanging between them. Just the simple truth that they were in this together, for better or worse. "I'm glad we did this," Samantha said, her voice soft as she squeezed his hand. "Me too," Mark replied. "Maybe we can do it again sometime." Samantha smiled, leaning her head against the window as the city skyline began to appear in the distance. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like they had a chance. Maybe it wasn't perfect, and maybe it never would be. But they had each other, and that was enough for now. The road ahead was still uncertain, but with Mark by her side, Samantha felt ready to face whatever came next. Together, they had taken a step forward, and for now, that was enough. The rest of the day passed slowly, each step a quiet echo of the last. As they reached the city, the noise of the world around them seemed to encroach upon the peaceful silence they had cultivated over the past few days. The honking of horns, the rush of people on sidewalks, and the constant hum of life returned in full force, but it didn't feel as jarring anymore. The trip had given them both something they hadn't realized they'd been missing. A chance to breathe, to see each other without the distractions of daily life. Mark reached over again, his thumb gently brushing against her hand as they sat at a red light. Samantha didn't mind the quiet now. It wasn't uncomfortable. It wasn't that silence they'd endured back home, that suffocating quiet of a relationship worn thin by words left unspoken and emotions buried. This silence was filled with understanding. "We're different now, aren't we?" Samantha said quietly, her gaze out the window. "I think so," Mark replied, his voice warm. "I don't think we're perfect, but we're better. And I think we've been needing this for a long time." Samantha nodded. There was no need for grand gestures or proclamations. She had realized during their trip that sometimes small moments, the ones that seemed insignificant at the time, were the ones that changed everything. A quiet word, a soft touch, the feeling of being truly seen by someone who had once been a stranger to her heart. Mark wasn't a perfect man, but he was hers, and for the first time in years, she felt she could be his too. They pulled into their apartment building's parking garage, the familiar concrete walls enclosing them once again. The weight of their return wasn't as heavy as it once would have been. They had something new, something that had been forged in the fire of their past mistakes, but tempered by their willingness to heal. Inside their apartment, things felt different. The stale air of old arguments, unspoken resentments, and forgotten moments no longer lingered in every corner. It felt like they had just moved in, as though they had a fresh start, a clean slate. The small things, the way Mark left his shoes by the door, the way Samantha's favorite mug sat on the kitchen counter, were still there. But now they felt like symbols of comfort rather than triggers for irritation. "I think we should go out," Samantha said, setting down her keys and turning to face Mark as he removed his jacket. "Not here, not yet. Let's go somewhere we haven't been in a while." Mark raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Aren't you tired of the whole city by now?" Samantha smiled. "Maybe a little. But I think we should just try again. A fresh start. Dinner out. Somewhere we can laugh and talk about what comes next." Mark was silent for a moment, considering her words. Then he smiled back, the weight of their shared history reflected in the quiet look he gave her. "I think that sounds perfect," he said softly, moving toward her and pulling her into an embrace. "Let's do it. Let's see where the road takes us." They went out, just like they had so many times before, only this time there was no underlying tension. No questions of whether they were making the right choices. No wondering if this was just another futile attempt to patch things up. It wasn't about fixing anything anymore. It was about moving forward, and knowing that, for the first time in a long time, they didn't have to carry the weight of the past on their shoulders. As they walked through the restaurant door, the sounds of life outside no longer felt like an intrusion. It felt like part of their new beginning. The restaurant, a place they used to visit often, felt different now. The familiar tables, the hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, it all felt like a part of the rhythm of life they were slowly finding their way back to. "I didn't think I'd ever feel like this again," Samantha said, sitting across from him, watching as the waiter poured their wine. "Like what?" Mark asked, a curious smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Like, everything's okay. Like the pieces fit again." Mark took a sip of his drink, looking at her with quiet admiration. "I'm glad you feel that way." For a while, they simply enjoyed the meal, talking about everything and nothing. It wasn't a conversation of grand gestures or heavy topics. It was light, easy, and filled with laughter. They weren't pretending, and they weren't avoiding. They were just being. They were just two people, Samantha and Mark, figuring it out, one step at a time. As the evening wound down, they made their way back to the apartment. The city had quieted a little, the night growing cooler, the lights of the streets dimming as they approached their building. The night felt full of promise, and for the first time in a long while, Samantha was no longer afraid of what tomorrow would bring. "I'm glad we did this," she said as they walked up the stairs to their door. "Me too," Mark said, his hand brushing hers as they reached the top. "I think this is just the beginning, Samantha. A real beginning this time." She looked up at him, seeing him for the first time without the filter of past disappointments, without the weight of unspoken words between them. She saw him, just Mark, just the man she had chosen to be with. And for the first time, she was at peace with that choice. They stepped inside their apartment, the door clicking shut behind them. And as they stood there, in the quiet of their home, everything felt right. Everything felt possible. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and for now that was enough. And in the silence that followed, as they stood side by side, Samantha felt a flicker of something inside her. Hope, maybe. A quiet, almost imperceptible flicker that whispered, "This is just the beginning." Samantha and Mark stood there in the center of their apartment, the world outside forgotten. The soft hum of the city, the distant traffic, the occasional honk, all faded into nothingness as they focused on each other. The tension they had carried for so long was gone now. The walls that had been built up, brick by brick, in their marriage were slowly coming down. "Do you remember when we first moved here?" Samantha asked softly, breaking the silence. Mark looked around the apartment, as though seeing it for the first time. "It feels like another lifetime, doesn't it?" She smiled, a quiet, bittersweet smile. "It does. We had no idea what we were getting into, did we?" Mark chuckled lightly, taking a step closer to her. "No, but that's the beauty of it, right? The mystery. The chance to find out together." Samantha's heart gave a small leap at his words. He was right. The unknown wasn't always a terrifying thing. It was just part of the journey. It was the things they couldn't anticipate, the things they couldn't control, that would define them. It wasn't just the destination that mattered, it was the road they traveled together. "I think we've been so focused on getting everything right that we forgot what it means to simply be with each other," she murmured, her fingers gently brushing his arm. "I think you're right," Mark said, his voice softer than before. "We've both been holding on so tight to what was, that we forgot to let go and just be." Samantha closed her eyes for a moment, letting the weight of his words settle into her. The years of misunderstandings, the fights, the silences, they were all part of it. But so were the moments like this. The quiet moments of clarity, of connection, of recognition. She remembered the early days when everything had been so easy, when they had laughed more, loved more, and somehow, despite everything, still felt as though they could conquer the world together. What if we just stopped trying so hard to be perfect? She asked, opening her eyes again to meet his gaze. Mark studied her face for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. What do you mean? I mean, what if we let go of the idea that we have to fix everything? What if we just took things one day at a time, without trying to rush towards something that might never come? Mark's eyes softened, and he nodded slowly. I think I'd like that, he said quietly. I think I'd like that a lot. Samantha smiled, feeling lighter than she had in months. Maybe that's all we need. Maybe we don't need to have all the answers right now. Maybe we just need to be honest with each other. To show up. To really show up. Mark stepped closer, his hand reaching for hers. I've been showing up, Sam. I know I've made mistakes, but I've been here. And I'm still here. I know, she whispered, squeezing his hand. And I'm here too. I think I've just been too afraid to admit it. The words lingered in the air between them. The silence that had once felt suffocating was now filled with understanding. It wasn't perfect, no. It wasn't even close. But it was real. And that was something they could work with. It was something they could build on. Mark leaned in slowly, his lips brushing hers in a gentle, unhurried kiss. The kind of kiss that didn't need words to explain it. It was the kiss of two people who had seen the worst in each other, but who were still willing to see the best. The kind of kiss that held the promise of starting anew. When they pulled away, neither of them spoke immediately. There was nothing left to say. Not yet. The silence felt right, like a deep breath before diving into something unknown, something full of possibility. After a long moment, Mark whispered, "Do you think we'll be okay?" Samantha looked into his eyes, seeing the vulnerability he rarely allowed himself to show. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the question settle within her. "I don't know," she said honestly. "But I think we'll figure it out. Together. Together." The word echoed in her mind as she wrapped her arms around him, feeling his heartbeat against her chest. Maybe the road ahead would be bumpy, maybe there would be times when they stumbled or even fell. But for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel afraid. They had each other. And that was enough. They stood there in each other's arms, the city outside still buzzing with life, but here, in this small apartment, in this moment, they were both at peace. And that peace was enough to face whatever came next. The next few weeks passed in a blur of new beginnings. Small moments of joy, coffee in the morning, quiet dinners at home, unexpected laughter, began to fill the spaces that had once been cold with resentment. Mark and Samantha weren't perfect. They didn't have it all figured out, and they knew there would still be days of uncertainty, days where they questioned everything. But they also knew that they had a choice, and that choice was to keep moving forward. One evening, as they sat on the balcony of their apartment, watching the sunset bleed into the horizon, Samantha leaned her head on Mark's shoulder, feeling the warmth of the moment. "You know," she said softly, "I think I'm starting to believe in us again." Mark turned to look at her, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I think I am too," he said quietly. And for the first time in a long time, the future didn't seem so daunting. They didn't need to know all the answers. They didn't need to be perfect. They just needed to keep showing up for each other. One day at a time. Together. As time passed, the small moments continued to stitch together the fabric of their shared life. There was no grand revelation or dramatic transformation, just the quiet unfolding of something they had both been longing for. Samantha and Mark, once fractured, now found themselves gradually finding their way back to each other in ways that felt natural and unforced. They weren't perfect. They still had their disagreements, their rough patches, but something fundamental had shifted. The walls that had once stood between them now felt thinner, almost non-existent at times. One evening, a few months after that pivotal conversation, they sat on the couch, the soft glow of a lamp casting a warm light around the room. Mark was flipping through a magazine, occasionally glancing over at Samantha, who was curled up with a book. "Do you think we're getting it right?" he asked, breaking the comfortable silence. Samantha looked up from her book, meeting his gaze. She smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "I think we are," she said softly. "It's not about getting it perfect. It's about trying. And we're trying." Mark nodded, his lips curling into a small grin. "Yeah, we are." She placed the book down on the coffee table, turning toward him. "I'm glad we're here, Mark. I'm glad we're doing this." He reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "Me too." Their fingers intertwined, and they sat there for a while, no words needed. There was a peace between them, a quiet understanding that hadn't been there before. It wasn't that everything had been fixed. It wasn't that the past had been erased. But there was a new foundation now built on honesty and patience with room to grow. Later that night, after they'd settled into bed, Mark rolled over to face Samantha. You know, I've been thinking about what you said, about showing up for each other, about not needing to be perfect. She turned her head slightly, meeting his eyes in the darkness. Yeah, he let out a quiet breath. It's the one thing I think I've been missing. I've spent so much of my life trying to get things perfect, to fix everything, but I think I've been missing the point. It's not about getting it right every time. It's about being there. It's about being present. Samantha's heart warmed at his words. She reached out, gently brushing her fingers over his cheek. I know. I think I've been afraid of not being enough, but I'm starting to realize that just showing up for each other, that's enough. Mark leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. It's more than enough. They lay there, their bodies close but not yet touching, wrapped in a comfortable silence. The years of uncertainty and tension that had plagued their marriage seemed distant now, like fading echoes. They had come a long way, and though the future was still uncertain, it felt more open now, filled with possibilities they were ready to face together. Samantha closed her eyes, a peaceful sigh escaping her lips. The past no longer had the power to haunt them, and the future no longer seemed like a weight to bear. The present, this quiet moment with Mark, was all that mattered, and that, for the first time in a long time, felt like enough. Months passed, and with each passing day, the bond between Samantha and Mark grew stronger. They had begun to carve out their own rhythm, their own way of being together. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. They had learned to navigate the complexities of their relationship with patience, understanding, and most importantly, honesty. One day, as they sat at a cafe sipping coffee, Mark reached for Samantha's hand across the table. I think we're finally there, he said quietly. Samantha looked up at him, her eyes soft with affection. There! He smiled, his eyes filled with warmth. Yeah, I think we've found our way back. And I think I'm finally okay with it not being perfect. She squeezed his hand in return. Me too. It wasn't about reaching some ideal destination or having everything figured out. It was about the journey, about being there for each other, no matter what. They had fought their way through the hardest parts, and now, together, they could face whatever came next. And as they sat there in the warm sunlight, the world around them moving in its own busy rhythm, they knew that no matter what the future held, they had each other. And that was more than enough. Samantha smiled, a quiet contentment settling in her chest. You know, she said softly, I think I'm really starting to believe in us. Mark leaned in, brushing his lips against her cheek in a gentle kiss. I've always believed in us, he whispered. And for the first time in a long time, Samantha allowed herself to believe it too. As the days passed, the once turbulent air between Caroline and James began to settle, much like the calm after a storm. There were still moments of tension, but they were fewer, and now their silences felt less like a chasm and more like shared space. Caroline found herself smiling more often, her laughter coming more easily, as if the weight of her insecurities was lifting little by little. James, too, seemed lighter, as though the weight of his past decisions and mistakes were no longer pressing him down quite so heavily. There was a new understanding between them, built on the rubble of their past mistakes and the quiet strength they were discovering in each other. They weren't perfect, no relationship ever was, but they were learning how to navigate the cracks and imperfections, how to heal together rather than apart. One afternoon, after a quiet lunch in the park, Caroline and James walked slowly along the edge of the lake. The trees were just beginning to show the first hints of autumn, their leaves turning gold and amber. The air was crisp but not cold, and the gentle breeze made the surface of the lake shimmer like 1,000 diamonds. Caroline turned to James, her eyes soft but earnest. I think I'm starting to believe again, she said quietly, her voice barely above the rustle of the wind. Not just in us, but in myself. James stopped walking, his heart beating a little faster. You should believe in yourself. You're stronger than you think. She smiled, the kind of smile that reached her eyes for the first time in months. I think, maybe I was always stronger than I knew. I just needed to see it. James took her hand in his grip warm and reassuring. We both needed to see it. Maybe that's what we were supposed to learn all along. They stood there for a moment, the quiet between them no longer uncomfortable but filled with something deeper, something that was beginning to feel like peace. That evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky with shades of pink and orange, Caroline and James sat on the porch of their home. The quiet hum of the neighborhood surrounded them, but for once it didn't feel oppressive. There was no rush, no urgency, just the simple comfort of being together. "Do you ever think about the future?" Caroline asked, her voice low but full of hope. James looked at her, the weight of everything they had been through settling in his chest. But there was something lighter now, something that felt like promise. "Every day," he said, his voice steady. "And for the first time in a long time, it feels like a future worth looking forward to." She leaned her head against his shoulder, the quiet of the moment wrapping around them like a warm blanket. "I'm ready for it," she said softly. Together. James kissed the top of her head, his heart swelling with something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Hope. And for the first time in a long time, he believed in it, in them, in the possibility of their future. The evening stretched on, the stars slowly appearing in the sky, each one a reminder of how far they had come. There were still challenges ahead, and the road to healing was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, they were walking it side by side, stronger than they had ever been, with a love that had been tested and found enduring. And for them, that was enough. As the final months of the year passed, their relationship grew even stronger. James continued to put in the work, not out of obligation, but out of a genuine desire to show Caroline that he could be the man she deserved. He never faltered, never wavered in his commitment, and slowly, the cracks in their foundation began to heal. Caroline, too, learned to trust again, not just James, but herself. She found her confidence returning, piece by piece, like the slow, steady unfolding of a flower. She began to embrace her own strength, to realize that her worth was not tied to the mistakes of the past, but to the person she had become through them. And together, they built something new. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't without its scars, but it was theirs, and it was real. They had both grown, both learned, and both found a way to love again, this time, with a deeper understanding, a deeper respect for what they had endured. When the first snow of winter fell softly outside their window, covering the world in a blanket of white, James and Caroline sat by the fire, their hands intertwined. The warmth between them was undeniable, and the quiet was filled with the promise of a future that was no longer uncertain. They had found their way back to each other, and for them, that was everything. With each passing day, James and Caroline felt the rhythm of their lives adjusting, like a melody finding its harmony after a discordant note. The intensity of the past had softened into something steadier, quieter. They had each found their own piece of peace amidst the turmoil they had weathered, and now, the quiet moments felt like treasures, moments when they didn't have to speak, when simply being together said everything they needed to say. James had learned to listen, really listen, without his defenses up. He no longer spoke over her, no longer tried to fix things before she had a chance to explain. And Caroline, for the first time in what felt like ages, found herself speaking her truth without fear of judgment or dismissiveness. She talked about her past, her insecurities, her dreams for the future, all of it laid bare between them. And each time she did, James proved that he was there to listen, to understand, and to support, without trying to make everything right. One evening, as they sat in their favorite cafe, a small, cozy place tucked on the corner of a quiet street, Caroline looked at James across the table. The soft glow of the pendant lights overhead cast a warm, golden hue on his face, and in that moment she saw him, not as the man who had made mistakes, but as the man who had stood by her, who had learned, and who had fought for them. "I never thought we'd make it through," she said quietly, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. James looked up at her, his brow furrowing in concern. "What do you mean?" She took a breath, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "I mean, after everything, I didn't think we'd come back from it. That I'd ever trust you again." He nodded, the weight of her words settling between them. "I didn't think you would either. But you kept proving me wrong," she said, meeting his gaze. "You kept showing up, kept fighting for us, and she paused, her heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and relief. "I think I'm finally ready to believe again." The words felt like a revelation, not just for Caroline, but for both of them. In that moment, she wasn't just speaking about trust in their relationship. She was speaking about trust in herself, in her own ability to heal, to move forward, and to love without fear. James reached across the table, his hand gently covering hers. "I've learned a lot. About love, about myself, about us. And I'm not going anywhere." Her heart beat faster at the sincerity in his voice. It was a promise that didn't come with conditions or hesitation. It was a promise rooted in everything they had been through, and everything they still hoped to build. "I'm not going anywhere either," she said, her voice steady, stronger than it had ever been. "I think we've earned that." As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the changes in their relationship were subtle but profound. They learned to communicate better, to respect each other's space and boundaries, and to share their dreams and fears without shame. They still had their disagreements. No relationship was ever free from them, but they faced each one as a team, with the understanding that their love was stronger than the challenges they faced. And slowly, they began to build a future together, brick by brick, with patience and care. They spent weekends exploring new places, taking small trips to see the world through fresh eyes, and they rediscovered the joy in the simple things: a quiet night in, a walk through the park, a shared meal. They learned to appreciate the moments that were easy, the ones that didn't require effort or compromise. One day, as they stood together on the balcony of their apartment, watching the city skyline stretch out before them, Caroline leaned her head against James's shoulder. "We've come a long way," she said softly, her voice filled with both wonder and gratitude. "Yeah," James replied, his arm wrapping around her waist. "But I think we're just getting started." And for the first time in a long time, Caroline believed him. They had built something real, something strong, and as long as they kept showing up for each other, kept choosing each other every day, they knew they could weather whatever came next. They didn't have all the answers. They didn't know what the future held. But for the first time, the uncertainty felt like a promise, not a threat. They had each other, and that, they knew, was more than enough. As winter set in, their home became a place of warmth and comfort, a place where the past was no longer a shadow but a foundation on which they had built their future. Caroline and James had found their way back to each other, and in doing so, had found themselves. The road wasn't always easy, but they had learned that love, like life, was a journey, one that was always worth taking. The stars above glimmered like beacons of possibility, and as they stood there together, hand in hand, they knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. And for the first time, the future didn't seem so uncertain after all. The soft hum of the city drifted up from below, the noise of busy lives flowing just outside their window. Inside, Caroline and James were silent for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts but tethered by the warmth that now filled their home. They had been through so much, their story full of dark chapters and light ones, each contributing to the tapestry of their relationship. But now it felt different. There was a quiet assurance between them, a calm that was earned and deeply felt. No longer were they the same two people they had been when everything fell apart. They were new, reborn from the ashes of their past, like a tree that had been pruned but had grown back stronger. "Can you believe how far we've come?" Caroline asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as she sat on the couch, watching James adjust a frame on the wall. James turned to face her, a soft smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "I can believe it, because we never gave up." He crossed the room to sit beside her, his hand finding hers. It was a quiet gesture, a simple touch, but it held everything that words couldn't express. Every promise they'd made to each other, every silent vow, now felt like a truth they both knew deep in their bones. "I'm glad we didn't," Caroline said, squeezing his hand. "But I'm even more glad we kept showing up. Every single day." James leaned in, pressing his forehead to hers for a brief moment. "I know. I think that's what makes this real. What makes us real." She closed her eyes, letting his presence wash over her. It was a relief, this peace. A relief that they had made it through the storm, together. She could feel the past, the hurt, the betrayal fading, becoming just another part of their history, no longer something that defined them. "You know," she murmured, opening her eyes to look into his, "I used to be so scared of losing myself, of being alone. But now," she trailed off, unsure how to articulate the shift within her. James smiled softly, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "Now you know that even when we were lost, we always had each other." Caroline nodded. "Yeah. And now, I feel like we can face anything. Like we've got this strength that wasn't there before." James didn't answer right away. He just sat there, his gaze thoughtful. "I think that's the beauty of it. We didn't get it all right. We made mistakes. But what matters is we learned. We're better for it." She laughed softly, a slight shake of her head. "Better for the mess? It doesn't always feel like it. Maybe not. But the mess, the pain, it was a part of our growth. We wouldn't be who we are without it." Caroline thought about that. The last few months had been hard, no question. But there was something almost poetic about the way they had rebuilt, step by step, word by word. They had stitched the fabric of their love back together, carefully, delicately. but with a kind of strength that came from knowing what it felt like to be torn apart. "We're stronger now," she said finally, with a confidence that matched his. James grinned, his eyes lighting up. "That's what I've been trying to say." Caroline chuckled, pulling him closer. "Well, I'm glad we're both on the same page." The night grew quieter as they sat there together, the world outside moving on, but for them, the moment felt suspended in time, peaceful, secure. They had learned to fight for each other, to forgive and to love, and in doing so, they had found something more beautiful than either of them could have imagined. As the night deepened, and they shared stories from their past and plans for their future, Caroline couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of gratitude. The road ahead was still uncertain, full of unknowns and potential hardships, but she was no longer afraid of them. She had James, and together, they could face whatever came next. And as the days passed, their love continued to grow, nourished by the lessons they'd learned and the resilience they'd built. No longer defined by the mistakes of the past, they had moved forward stronger, more whole, with a love that was not just surviving, but thriving. And in that quiet, imperfectly beautiful way, Caroline knew, as did James, that they had truly made it through. And that was enough. For now. For always. The evening stretched out like a canvas of possibilities, the last remnants of the setting sun turning the sky into a deep violet. The world outside felt distant, distant enough for them to savor their own quiet sanctuary. Their home was no longer just the place where they resided. It had become a reflection of their journey together, a space full of memories, both painful and beautiful, that had shaped them into who they were now. Caroline rested her head on James' shoulder as they sat together on the couch, the soft hum of the city far below a mere background noise to their shared quiet. They didn't need words anymore. The silence between them was as comfortable as their most cherished conversations, the kind that didn't require explanation. "I was thinking," Caroline started softly after a moment, breaking the stillness, "about how much we've changed, how much we've both grown." James didn't immediately respond. Instead, he brushed a strand of hair away from her face, his fingers grazing the soft curve of her jaw. "You're right. We've come a long way, haven't we?" Her smile was slow, almost bittersweet. "I never imagined we'd get here. But I'm glad we did." James smiled back, but there was a shadow in his eyes, something unspoken that still lingered. He hadn't quite shaken the guilt, even now, for what they had gone through, for his part in it all. But Caroline had never asked him to forget the past. She had simply asked him to be here now, in this moment with her. "You know, I think I've learned something important through all of this," he continued after a pause, his voice low. "That real love isn't perfect. It's not about avoiding the mistakes, but about owning them, and making sure that we're here to grow together." Caroline closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. "I needed to hear that. I think I've been scared for a long time, afraid that the mess would break us. But I see it now, the mess is part of what makes us real." James kissed the top of her head gently. "And we're real, Caroline. More than we've ever been." She pulled back slightly to look at him, her heart full. "So what now? After everything we've been through, how do we move forward from here?" He took her hand in his thumb tracing the familiar lines of her palm. "We take it one day at a time, and we make sure we keep showing up for each other. That's all we can really do." "Sounds like a good plan," she said with a quiet laugh, squeezing his hand. The soft glow of the city lights filtered through the windows, bathing the room in a golden hue. There was a certain magic in the way the light played off the surfaces of their living room, casting soft shadows and highlighting the details of their home. The small things, framed photos on the walls, the plant she'd carefully nurtured in the corner, the coffee mugs on the table, reminded her of everything they had built together. Her gaze shifted to the window, watching as the last traces of daylight slipped away, replaced by the cool, calming darkness of night. It was a beautiful moment, a moment that felt full, complete, yet still open to whatever came next. For the first time in a long while, Caroline wasn't afraid. They had been through storms, through heartbreak, through anger and betrayal, but they had come through it. They had come through together. And that was enough. James pressed a kiss to her forehead, his hand moving to cup her cheek. "I love you, Caroline. More than I can say." Tears stung her eyes, but they were no longer tears of sadness or regret. These were the tears of a woman who had come through the hardest parts of her life, who had learned to trust again, to open her heart again. "I love you too, James. I always have." The room fell into a quiet peace, the only sound the soft rustling of the leaves outside, dancing in the evening breeze. And in that moment, Caroline knew with certainty that no matter what came next, they would be okay. They would face it all together. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't seem so uncertain. It seemed full of hope, full of possibility. And that, she thought, was exactly what they both needed. As the days passed, the complexity of their emotions began to surface. Tension that had quietly simmered between Caroline and James turned into a full storm. Every conversation, every glance, was weighted with the knowledge that their lives would never be the same. The house, once filled with laughter and easy comfort, now seemed like a cavern of uncertainty. Caroline found herself retreating into silence more often than not. She sat by the window, her gaze lingering on the outside world, feeling the separation between herself and the man she had once loved. James, too, seemed to be a shadow of the man she had married. He moved through their home like an outsider, his eyes searching for something he couldn't quite grasp. Their marriage, once a vibrant living thing, had become a faded portrait. They no longer shared the same passions, the same dreams. The weight of what had happened hung between them like a wall they could neither scale nor tear down. Samantha's presence in their lives had only deepened the cracks, and no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't repair the damage. One night, as Caroline sat at the kitchen table, James approached her. His footsteps were tentative, almost hesitant, as if he wasn't sure how to bridge the growing chasm. He stood there for a moment before speaking, his voice low and careful. "I don't want this, Caroline," he said. "I don't want to lose you." Caroline's heart clenched at the words. She had heard them before, many times, but now they didn't hold the same weight. She had been waiting for him to make a choice, to act on the words he had spoken. But the reality of their situation was clear. No amount of words could undo the pain, the betrayal. "I don't know if I can believe that anymore," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You've hurt me in ways I never imagined possible." James's face crumpled, and for the first time in a long while, she saw the man she had once fallen in love with. He wasn't the perfect husband, but he had been her companion, her partner. She wanted to believe that they could fix things, that they could find their way back to the love they had once shared. But the damage was too deep, and time had run out. "I know I've failed you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "But I'll do anything, Caroline. Anything to make it right." Caroline looked at him, her heart torn between the man she had loved and the reality of their fractured relationship. The tears that had been building up for so long finally spilled over, her sobs echoing in the quiet room. She had spent so much time trying to hold on to something that was slipping through her fingers, unable to admit that maybe it was time to let go. Her love for James had been real, but it was no longer enough to save them. "I can't," she finally said, her voice breaking. "I can't keep pretending everything is fine when it's not." James's eyes filled with tears as he knelt before her, reaching for her hands. "Please, Caroline, don't do this." But Caroline knew deep down that this was the end. They had reached a crossroads, and the path ahead was no longer one they could walk together. She had loved him with everything she had, but now she needed to love herself more than the ghost of a relationship that once was. "Goodbye, James," she said softly, pulling her hands away from his grasp. The words stung as they left her lips, but she knew it was the only way forward. For both of them, the months that followed were painful, but necessary. Caroline began to rebuild her life, piece by piece, learning to find her own happiness outside the confines of her marriage. James, too, faced the consequences of his actions, realizing the depth of what he had lost. Samantha, for all her role in the unraveling of their relationship, had become a part of their past, a reminder of the mistakes that had been made. In the end, Caroline found a new sense of peace. It wasn't the life she had envisioned, but it was hers. And that was enough. The end of her marriage was not the end of her story. It was just the beginning of something new.